So BC, particularly susceptible, our ecosystem is not meant to neutralize the acid coming from acid rain. Smog potential. I'm going to show you a picture here. This was taken from the top of Gross Mountain, I believe, or Cypress, but on December 1st of this year, after about 3 days of sunlight. And as you can see, you can barely see the Burnaby. This is something that we face every summer in particular. It can be hazardous to human health. It can exacerbate respiratory problems. Smog is not a pleasant thing to deal with, and it's something that is a very real impact that we have to deal with. In particular, the Fraser Valley is an enclosed airshed, and they're very sensitive to smog. So lower mainland air quality is poor. I was on the government website, and they identified the Fraser Valley as one of the worst locations for smog in Canada. Okay, so Nick is going to talk about ozone depletion next. Thanks.
Okay, ozone depletion is measured in kilograms of fluorocarbon-11 equivalents. And what the Tracy program does is it measures the masses of other chemicals that contribute to ozone depletion in the atmosphere. It then gives a factor to give it a significance as compared to fluorocarbon, and move that in accordance to that significance. As ozone depletion itself has a major effect in the South Pole, where a lot of these chemicals concentrate. Here you can see from 1981 to 1999 the amount of depletion in the ozone layer. Australia has a major issue with this. And also, Seattle, which is just our neighbor to the south, has seen a huge increase in the amount of skin cancer within the last multiple years. Human health, respiratory effects potential. This is a major effect in the lower mainland, mostly because of the smog and also particulate matter. Here we measured the amount of particulate matter in the air due to all our emissions. This is measured in sizes ranging from 10 micrometers down to 2.5 micrometers. And everything is measured back to the kilograms parts per million of 2.5 micrometer sizes. This particulate matter has a huge effect on human health. The EPA in the United States has given it one of as the #1 cause of deterioration in human health in their country. So major problems with this one. Impacts include asthma, bronchitis, acute pulmonary disease, among many others. Primary energy consumption, measured in megajoules of energy, is a measure of how much indirect and direct energy goes into producing all these materials that go into a building. And it includes all the material transportation, processing, converting it, and delivering it to the sites. You can see with my next slide here, this forest science building that we're in right now is taking about 60 million joules worth of energy to create. And this is equivalent to about heating 500 homes in Canada for about 13.5 months. It's a lot of energy. Weighted resource use. This one's a little bit tricky. It's not as easily understood as the rest. It's a measure of how much impact extraction of these materials is caused on the environment. It takes into account how much or how they're extracted, the effects they have on the carrying capacity of the area that they're affecting, the intensity of the impacts, extent of the area impacted, duration of the impacts, and the ecological significance of those. This can be applied to the oil sands up north in northern Alberta, garbage, forestry, and the cutting down of all the timber. This, for instance, this building is made out of all timber, which has a less impact as you would think that the oil sands project would have. Now we're going to move on to the results of our study.
tutor, I'm going to present some of the results of the study. First, I think it's important to remember a couple of things. These are all preliminary results. We don't actually have 100% of the information. We have to take into account we were only looking into the structure and the envelope, which we have already mentioned. It was a cradle-to-gate approach. It's a non-regionalized impact assessment, and we have some issues with data vintage, which means that the antenna assumed that all the buildings that are being modeled were built today, whereas we know that some of the buildings were built up to 100 years in the past. And I just want to tell you that we're not showing you all of the results because we have tons of data. So we're just gonna have a peek at that. First, this is the average impact of the UBC academic buildings. This is how it looks for each of the impact categories. Probably the numbers do not say much by themselves, but the important thing is when we start looking at the numbers in a relative measure, which takes me to this graph. This is a graph that is measuring the percentage of difference of each building versus the UBC average. The UBC average is right here in the zero line. So we can see how each building performs, looking at the primary energy consumption category versus the average. So we know, for example, that the chemistry or the math building perform better against the average, whereas the chem bio or the chem building perform worse. So that gives us a baseline to know basically how our buildings are performing. So this graph is pretty similar to the last one, but showing the global warming potential versus the UBC average again. What is interesting is that all the buildings are arranged in chronological order. So we go from the chemistry building, which was built in 1975, to the case building, which was built just 5 years ago. So we see that the impacts are not necessarily getting better. This graph now shows all the different impact categories aggregating into just one column. So you guys can see how we have, for each of the building, each of the impacts behave. And we see, for example, for the math building, how most of the impact categories are below average, and some of them are above average as ozone depletion. But the important thing is this does not say much by itself. So we need to take into account and look deeper into the numbers to see why this happened, right? So we try to see what's different between, for example, we go back between the math building, which appears to be performing better than the average, to see one of the buildings that is performing in average behavior, and one of the buildings came by that is performing way above average. So what's going on here? So we look into the materials. What's in the building and why is this happening? So we see, for example, the math building, which was performing better. It has a lot of wood. Wood is the blue bar, and it has just a tiny bit of concrete compared to the rest of the buildings. The FNH building was in average behavior, and we see compared to the chem bio, which was way above average, it doesn't have as much bricks and as much wall coverings. So this sheds some light on what are the materials that are actually causing impacts, which take us to the next section, which are the materials in the buildings presented by Manny.
All right, so summary measures are measured from construction materials, and once again, to remind you guys, it's from cradle to gate. So it was computed from raw resource extraction to construction. And so on the previous slide, we saw that timber structures perform below average of the UBC buildings, and let's take a look why. So here we have the production of timber, the process flow for timber. It's a pretty straightforward process from timber harvesting to processing. There isn't as much energy involved when you compare it to something like concrete. And so what we have there is the process flow for cement. As you can see, there is a lot of energy involved in the kiln to heat it to about 1500 Celsius, and also a lot of energy involved with in the clinker and cooling of the materials. And so if we were to compare a volume of wood to a volume of concrete,